Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. Today's conversation promises to be an insightful one with a remarkable guest. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular listener, we're so glad you're here. Our goal is to bring you closer to the innovative leaders and thinkers shaping our future. And today, I am thrilled to welcome General Robert Caslen. General Caslen served 43 years in the U.S. Army, including 7 combat and overseas deployments, culminating in his role as the 59th Superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He authored the Department of Defense Strategy for the Global War on Terror and later the 29th President of the University of South Carolina. A respected voice on leadership, ethics, and national security, he co-authored The Character Edge, Leading and Winning with Integrity, and wrote Impossible Mission, The Withdrawal of U.S. Forces from Iraq. He continues to contribute to national security and leadership education as a trustee of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College Foundation and Salem University. A graduate of West Point, he also holds advanced degrees from Kansas State University, Long Island University, and a DBA in business at Salem University. A former NCAA offensive center for the Army football team, he is a Kansas State Engineering Hall of Fame inductee, a United States Military Academy honor graduate, and recipient of the prestigious NCAA Teddy Roosevelt Award. Bob is an avid outdoor person, hunter and fly fisher, and he and his wife, Michelle, live in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. Welcome to Tipping Spears, General Caslen.
Hannah, thank you very much. Honor to be with you. Thank you very much for having me today.
Well, I'd love to start out today with one of my favorite questions, which is, where does your story begin?
Well, my name used to be Casalingo. So my grandparents, all 4 of my grandparents, were born in Italy, immigrated back in the early 1900s, and so my grandfather, who came as a Casalingo, wanted to Americanize his family, so he dropped the name to Caslen, Caslen, and we lived in a Italian community in New Britain, Connecticut. And my dad was a World War II veteran, and he got into education after that as a professor. And then he became a school principal, school teacher, and school principal of an elementary school. But that wasn't good enough for him. So he and mom went on a ski trip vacation to Vermont, and he decided to get out of education and he wanted to be the owner and the host of a ski lodge. So I did my high school years in a ski lodge in northern Vermont at Jay Peak, and traveled on the bus 15 miles one way every day to school and then back home again after all the different sport practices at the end of the day. And it was out of there that I got recruited to play football to West Point. Never heard of West Point, had no idea, except it was a free education. And my dad was excited about me going to West Point because he didn't have to pay for college tuition. And then I fell in love with the opportunity to serve my country. So that's kind of where it all began.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you got to West Point. What sparked your interest in, turning, military service into a career, kind of going beyond that initial kind of commitment?
Well, when anybody graduates from the military academies, they have a 5-year commitment to
Mm-hmm.
the country, to their country. And I was absolutely determined to do my 5 years and to get out and go in the corporate world and business someplace. But when I entered the military after Vietnam, the military was really broken. They were rebuilding itself. There was a lot of discipline and racial issues. And as an infantry, I was an infantry soldier. So as an infantryman, we had a platoon of about 30 soldiers. We became so close and so tight. We had some problems, racial problems that we had to work our way through. But I fell in love with back then there was just men in the infantry. Now they have men and women, but I fell in love with the brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
I played football and we were very close as teammates. We called ourselves the brotherhood, the football team. And then I found myself as a leader of a platoon, a bunch of soldiers, and we had that same brotherhood again. Today it's the brotherhood and the sisterhood. But I just they depended on me, and I depended upon them, and then we had each other's backs all the time. And I just fell in love with not only the brotherhood that was there, but also the opportunity to serve my country. And then when things started heating up and we found ourselves, whether it was in Panama or Haiti or Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and then Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, I found myself smack in the middle of all those opportunities and those deployments. And I really fell in love with the fact that my country trusted me to lead their sons and daughters in the crucible of combat in tough situations. And I enjoyed the opportunity to do that. I didn't enjoy the work we were doing. I know it was just tough work. We lost soldiers, which was also painful as you could imagine. But we really enjoyed the opportunity to serve our country and to stand in the gap between the evil that's out there and what our country stands for.
So was there a particular event or person, that served as a catalyst for your career?
Um, what really changed my mind from getting out after 5 years to staying in for 43 years was my what they call the first battalion commander. I was a brand new lieutenant, and he was a Vietnam veteran lieutenant colonel, and this guy was an amazing leader. And he was a leader not because he was boastful or arrogant. He was a leader because he cared for us and he developed us.
Mhm.
And he was the type of leader that I aspired to be like. And he was a great role model as well. When I was around him, I said, I want to be like him. I want to do what he's doing. And the being in the military, serving your country was just an opportunity to be like him and to be able to lead soldiers and to have that brotherhood and that close, very close brotherhood that exists within those organizations and those units. So he was my model and he was my mentor for a few years. He's now passed, but he's somebody that really changed my mind to leaving the military after 5 years and then stay in the military much longer.
So every journey, has its hurdles. What are some of the biggest obstacles that you faced in your career, and how did you overcome them?
Well, there weren't so much obstacles, but they were like, okay, a new assignment, a new rank,
Hmm.
new levels of responsibility, and um, but your leaders trusted you that they were going to give you this position in this leadership position. And although those were hurdles, those were challenges, I said, okay, but let's go, bring it on, and we're going to do what we need to do, and we're going to represent our country, represent those organizations, take care of our soldiers. So it was not one particular thing that was an obstacle that I overcame. My biggest obstacles, we'll get there later, was when I left the military afterwards, my transition into the civilian world.
Hmm. Well, that's a great perspective, a good way to frame it. So on September 11th, 2001, you were in the Pentagon. Can you tell us, about that day and how the terrorist attacks, impacted your life, our military and our nation? I mean, most of us were watching this on a screen, and you were right there.
Well, certainly a day we'll never forget. Um, I was in my office, which is on the outer ring of the Pentagon, and there's a TV in my office. So a lot of my colleagues huddled around the TV. We watched the planes go into the World Trade Center.
Mhm.
And I remember telling them, I said, the next target is going to be a command center.
Mhm.
And 19 minutes later, the plane went into the Pentagon.
Mhm.
That was about two sides over from where I was, but we all were immediately required to evacuate the Pentagon. And so we did. So I stood outside and watched the Pentagon burning. I saw the medevac aircraft that was coming in, and we felt so helpless. And I, two things. One was I said, life as we know it has just changed, and this is going to be significant, and we're going to get involved in the days and the months and the years ahead, which turned out to be Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom, Afghanistan and Iraq. But just standing there watching that, I said, we just can't just stand here. We got to go help out. We got to go do something. There was about four or five of us, and we said we're going to get back into the Pentagon. So we went back into the door where we evacuated, and the security guards wouldn't let us in. Then we went to another door, another door. Finally, we found a door that was not occupied, and we were able to get back into the Pentagon. And then we started helping out with some of the medevacs that were going on, and everybody in all the cafeterias had left. So all the oil, we like do French fries and stuff like that was boiling over. So we had to clean all that and turn that off. Uh, one of the fellows that was with me is from the Navy, and he was an expert in firefighting. It's one of the things they teach, because if you have a fire on a ship in the middle of the ocean, everybody's got to learn how to be able to fight that fire. He ran outside, found a fire engine, got a smoke detector, brought the smoke detector back in, and we started going around the Pentagon finding where the smoke was significant. Some of the guards were still in there, and it was unhealthy for them, and we were helping them to evacuate. He got into Secretary Rumsfeld's office. He was in the middle of a meeting with a bunch of smoke. He put the smoke detector right on the table in the middle of the meeting. Rumsfeld said, "This is the man that saved my life," and so they moved the meeting to another place that was a little bit more secure. And then we started evacuating some of the other folks and helping them through the smoke to get out of there. And we just did what we had to do. And I ended up next thing I did is I said we need to set the command center up. So we had to put the command center up, and then it had to be occupied. And we had established communications with the president for the Secretary of Defense because he was away in his Air Force One, and he was down in Florida. Then I guess he went to another location, and so we had to connect with him to make sure that we were getting his guidance and informing him what was happening, at least in the Pentagon, and what we knew was going up in New York. And so we just kind of did that work, and we stood the command center up and got the communications up and running, and it wasn't until about 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night when I called up my wife. I said, "Hon, I got to get out of here and get home." I said, "I have no idea because I where I parked my pickup truck, it was right near where the plane went in, and I had no idea whether it was damaged or not." So I said to her, "Be prepared to come get me if we don't have a truck anymore." When I got to my truck, it was all covered with soot, and there was an airplane wheel right next to it. And so, and if anybody says that no, this is some conspiracy theory other than an airplane going into the Pentagon, I can tell them that's not exactly correct at all because there was a airplane wheel right next to it, and I saw it. Got to my truck and kind of wiped all the soot away to see if it was damaged. Unfortunately, it was not damaged. The one right next to me had his window shattered, but nevertheless, and I drove home and then drove back the next day, and we knew we had to get put together teams that interagency type teams. So we started working with the State Department and some of the other different departments and then we also had to try to understand who was this, what did they do, why did they do this, and so we had to really understand the whole dynamics behind the attacks against us and who exactly and where they came from. We had a good idea right up front, but those were some of the initial tasks afterwards. And that was in September, and I went to Afghanistan in January or February, shortly afterwards. My old commander was going to command the conventional force that was up in Afghanistan. He needed a chief of staff, so he grabbed me out of the joint staff to be his chief of staff there in Afghanistan, and then went back to his place for another 6 months, and then we redeployed back to Afghanistan again. And we came full circle all the way around from where they planned and initiated the operation from. And then all of a sudden, we were the ones that were attacked, and now we were the ones back into Afghanistan, addressing what had happened to America.
Well, it's fascinating to hear your firsthand experiences on a day that I think every American alive during that time vividly remembers. So I know you've got a new book out on the Iraq War, The Impossible Mission. It was a fascinating read. I really enjoyed it. In the book, you drive home a really interesting point about how we tend to scrutinize, decisions to go to war, but we fail to analyze decisions to end wars. And that was something I hadn't really thought about until kind of reading your writings. Can you kind of expound on kind of the key takeaways of the book and what kind of inspired you to put pen to paper on this?
Yeah, so there's political decisions and then there's strategic decisions, and you have to develop the strategy for the policies that were established.
Mhm.
I was frankly surprised that we decided to go to Iraq that came out of the same meeting with the secretary and the president, why they wanted to go to Iraq when all of this originated from Afghanistan. But Afghanistan was first, and that's what we had to put together to get ready for that. The the problem with terminating a war is, if you remember, candidate presidential candidate um, I'm sorry, president not not so the president just said the president said, well, we're going to terminate.
Mhm.
Wars. This we've been at this war long enough,
Mhm.
and as a result of him saying we've been at this war long enough, my point was, well, what are our national interests? We went to war in Afghanistan to defeat terrorist organizations that had global capability, and we went and then to deny safe haven of terrorist organizations like the Taliban, and then we went to war in Iraq to keep the most dangerous weapons out of the hands of the most dangerous people. Um, so we felt that we needed, or the president felt that we needed to terminate Iraq, and then sooner or
Mhm.
later, afterwards was Afghanistan. But the national interests, did we accomplish the national interests? Did we defeat terrorist organizations in Iraq? And then did we deny safe haven? And so those were the policy decisions. And then once you leave, then you got to realize what's your national interests, and then what are your national interests at risk.
Mhm.
And I'm not convinced that, and this I address this in the book, on whether or not the reason we left um, the reason we left Iraq, did it accomplish what our national interests were? Did we keep the most dangerous weapons out of the hands of the most dangerous people? And to deny terrorist organizations safe haven.
Mhm.
So I felt that we had to look at what our national interests were. And then this is where government comes in place. What are your strategic objectives? And then what are the programs to meet those objectives, those end states? And what are the resourcing? Inclusive in the resourcing are the authorities that are necessary for you to be there.
Mhm.
And we lost the authority at the end of December. And when U.S. forces withdrew, and there was no effort to regain our authority to be there again.
Mhm.
So there was a foreign military requirement, foreign military sales requirement, but there were also requirements for mentoring the next generation of Iraqi military leaders. And there was a lot of problems with Iraq with the Kurds, and they needed negotiation efforts that we had led and that I personally led when I was there as division commander. And a lot of those issues I felt were not adequately addressed, and they led to problems why we were there, whether we should be there or not, and what was the aftermath of us not being there.
Mhm.
For example, when we actually left Iraq, the Prime Minister Maliki, for whatever motive that was there, wanted to make sure that he, as a Shia, was protected, and that there was no Sunni, because he had a Sunni vice president, he had a Sunni deputy prime minister, he had some other Sunnis in his cabinet, and they were there when U.S. forces were there. When U.S. forces left, he immediately fired and arrested all of his Sunni people so that he can have a Shia organization that was put in place, and that was going to it was going to centralize his security there as the prime minister, and that led to the disenfranchisement of the Sunnis. And then what happened after that was they released all of the Camp Bucca Sunni leaders that had been incarcerated over the 8.5 years that U.S. forces were there. They were released, and then there was a lot of the Sunnis were disenfranchised. So what the disenfranchised, so they allowed safe haven to take place. So all of the when we had the surge, and a lot of the foot soldiers, the Sunni foot soldiers in the north, went over to Syria. They came back into the safe haven. So you had this perfect trifecta of a safe haven with radical leaderships and foot soldiers that had returned. And then they decided that they wanted to establish themselves and call themselves the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq, ISIS. And as a result of bringing ISIS in there, then you had the caliphate that they established. They created their own government up in the north, and that required U.S. forces to return. So we never really thought through the U.S. presence after we had terminated our authority to be there and what that presence was going to look like. There was a lot of discussions within the United States government and the different departments on that presence. If you remember back in Korea in 1953, in the armistice that was put in place, they put a couple division headquarters in Korea and South Korea. And that kind of led the peace and kept the stability in place so that the democratic infrastructure of Korea can grow. And it did. It grew to be one of the most strongest economic organizations in the economic countries in all of Asia. And the same thing that happened after World War II in Germany. So what are we going to leave in Iraq? If we're going to leave altogether, then we're just going to leave um, that infighting that was going to take place and not give them the opportunity to grow with representative governments like that, like what that which was necessary.
That's a great example, General Caslen, with Korea and Germany. I think people tend to kind of fail to recognize that when we pull out of a country kind of this vacuum or this space that, bad actors like ISIS utilize to regain influence and territory. And it's Korea and Germany are just such great examples of how that didn't occur. So what do you think people tend to misunderstand, about the Middle East or, Operation Iraqi Freedom or Operation Enduring Freedom, kind of those GWAT wars? Are there any, lessons learned that you would like to communicate to folks that may have some misunderstandings, about the Middle East?
And the one thing that I really learned was to really understand the culture of the ethnic groups that were there, and to understand the ethnic groups and their historical divides.
Mm.
Iraq is unique because a number of those divides go right outside of Baghdad.
Mm.
So one of the divides is the Sunni Shia divide, and that's the disagreements among the Islamic groups on, who is the follower of Muhammad, and which one is the preeminent ethnicity, whether it's the Sunni or the Shia. So the Sunni and Shia divide is one example. That goes all the way back for years, for centuries. Um, Saddam, for example, was a Sunni, and he was leading with authority within his country, and the Sunnis were the minority, where Iraq was the majority. And a lot of the Shia leaders, when Saddam was there, sought refuge in Iran, and Iran is principally Shia. So you had the Shia from Iraq that went into Iran. And so now that they're in a democratic government elected and running the country as Shia. So it's important to understand the Sunni Shia divide and then the links within the Middle East as a result of that. And then even within the Sunnis, there's another divide. It's the moderates Sunnis with the radical Sunnis. Osama bin Laden, for example, was a radical. Zawahiri was one of the on the radical side because they felt everything ought to be under the Sunni, because the Sunnis are the ones that were the closest to Muhammad, and they're the ones that should be in the leadership of the Islamic countries. And so it's important to understand the radical Sunnis, and then you got the moderate Sunni that looking at the future of their nation more with economic success and representative governance. So you have the moderate Sunnis and the radical Sunnis in that particular divide. And then you have the one thing that unites Sunnis and Shia is the Kurds. So the northern part of Iraq is Kurdistan, and the Kurds bleed over into Turkey, into Iran, and into Syria. And the one thing that upsets the other Islamic ethnic groups in Iraq, the Sunnis and the Shia, and that's one thing that will unite them is the Kurds. So you have the Kurd-Arab conflict as well, and then of course you have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is there in Israel and outside of Israel. But those other divides, those other three divides, the Sunni Shia, the radical and the moderate Sunni, and the Kurd Arab divides are all right there in Iraq. Those divides in the Middle East all come together right there outside of Baghdad. It's just important to understand that so that when decisions are made in governance and decisions are made on the economy by leaders, it's important to understand their ethnic background and the history of their ethnic background. So that's one thing I learned more than anything. And in the book, we cover that. I cover that as best I can to help people that aren't familiar with those divides to understand where they're coming from and what they're looking for in the future.
And it's really, really insightful. I think it's something that most folks aren't tracking on. They just think, okay, peace building, how do we do this, from thousands of miles away? And you make a great point about understanding the people there and kind of what's going on the ground. So I know you've led at every level from war zones, to being superintendent at West Point. What leadership strategies stayed consistent throughout your career? And then which ones changed as, the levels of responsibility shifted?
Yeah, well, any leadership strategy has to be a strategy to build trust within those whom you lead and those that you're working for. Um, Stephen Covey wrote a great book called The Speed of Trust. And in there, he says trust is a function of both competence and character. And it's just really important to understand as a leader, if you're going to be a leader, you've got to be a leader that's competent and you got to be a leader that aspires to the values of your institution defined by your character. In other words, you're going to be a leader of character. And if you have, just like Stephen Covey says, and you're a leader of character and competence, you're going to be a leader that people respect and one that you can get things done.
Mhm.
But I really enjoyed and I love the brotherhood, like I said, and the sisterhood that exists within the military because you really create those tight groups and you build those effective teams. And I've realized that the most effective leaders are those that build the best teams because those teams operate together and you've got in the team, you've got unique skill sets from each one of the team members, and collectively they just make the organization that much stronger. I also believe in authentic leadership. Authentic leadership is the leadership where you're authentic. In other words, you're transparent. So subordinates don't have to guess where you're coming from. They know. I mean, you're predictable. And because of you're an authentic leader, you're a leader of high character. And that character is defined by the values of your institution. And the values of the Army, for example, are loyalty and duty and respect, selfless service, honor and integrity, and personal courage. And when you've embodied those values, they become part of your very essence. So when you're confronted with a compromising situation, you don't have to guess or think about what right looks like. You've embodied that, and the natural expression is are the values of which you've aspired to. It's like holding a cup of coffee. If you hold a cup of coffee and someone hits you in the elbow, whether you want it or not, that coffee is going to spill. So if you're a leader of character and you've embodied the values of that institution, when someone rubs you the wrong way, what's going to come out and how you're going to react to it is going to be in accordance with the values that you've internalized.
That's such a great visual. I love the coffee cup example. I know you've written, another terrific book, along with Mike Matthews called The Character Edge. Can you share, why y'all wrote the book, what inspired y'all to tackle such a timely and important topic?
Yeah, when I retired from when I retired from the Army after I was a superintendent, Mike Matthews, a great friend, was one of the professors and had done a lot of research on leadership. And and we realized that if you're going to be an effective leader, the most important element that makes you an effective leader is that trust, like I said, and that trust is embodied around the values that you've internalized and the values that you stand for, and those values define your character. And that's what the book is all about. When I was a division commander in Iraq, um, I had a number of senior leader misconducts that I had to adjudicate, and going into my division command leadership, I said to everybody, senior leader misconduct, which is misconduct that's defined by senior non-commissioned officers and all officers. And I had, I think, 78 acts of misconduct that I had to either give a letter of reprimand or relieve from their duty. And it was not so much because they are now gone as an individual and their career, for the most part, will have terminated, but it just made their organization that they were in command of ineffective. So character becomes a very important element to be of effective leadership, and that's why when Mike Matthews asked if I would write the book, I said absolutely. This is something I strongly believe in, and I'm glad to be able to write the book about character and the impact of character and effective leadership.
Well, one thing I really appreciated about your book was the emphasis on how character, is developed. It's not just something that, some people have, they're born with, or they just decide to be a person of high character. It's a discipline, it's a practice, it's a commitment. And I really appreciated that approach to it. Do you think, our society prioritizes character development, enough? And if not, what are your thoughts on how we should go about it to do it better?
No, that's a great point. I think character is developed. So for example, at West Point, men and women, because just by law,
Mm.
Congress members appoint or nominate their candidates from across the country, from all the senators, all the House representatives.
Mhm.
So all the different communities throughout our country are represented in the United States Military Academy and all the service academies. And those young men and women come to West Point with the characters that they've been raised with. From those character values that they've internalized come from their family, they come from their high school, their friends. Some are consistent with duty, honor, country, which are the values of West Point, and some are not consistent. Our responsibility was to teach duty, honor, country, and loyalty, duty, respect, and the other Army values, to reflect on them, on how they impact us, and then to have these conversations that allow us to see where we are as compared to where we really need to be. So over time, we have internalized them. It also creates the environment that and the culture of that environment where it really defines what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And when you understand that, then you have the freedom of movement within your left and right acceptable and not acceptable limits. And that's where and then character is evaluated. So, the leadership within the cadets and the leadership of the officers oversight of the cadets grades them not only in their performance and competence, but also grades them in their character. And then they have conversations, mentoring conversations on whether you're doing well, you're not doing well. This is where you have a character strength. This is where you need to work on your character and things like that. And there are some character issues that, if they're violated, result in your termination from the military academy as well.
Yeah, y'all have a West Point does a great job of putting the concept of character develop, in action. I think it's character development is something people throw around all the time, and I've just always been very impressed with kind of how y'all at West Point make it happen. So after serving as the superintendent at West Point, you retired from the Army and you were selected as the 29th president of the University of South Carolina. And I know in 2021, there were national headlines, saying that you'd used a quote in a speech without attribution. Can you tell us, about that experience, and kind of what you took away from it?
Well, this goes to the heart of what I was talking about on character. So, we were in the middle of COVID,
Mhm,
and in an overnight decision, we had to make the decision to go online.
mhm,
So, and then we went online for an extended period of time, as all universities throughout the country did. And the change and the dramatic change was difficult for the students, but
mhm,
they did a magnificent job. So when it came time for commencement, particularly that senior class that did not join a residential senior class because they were home the whole time,
mhm,
I told my speechwriter at the commencement events, and there were numerous commencement events because as the president of the University of South Carolina, you're attending a lot of the colleges, but you also are the president of the system, which includes 4 2-year schools and 2 4-year schools. So you're going from one commencement event to another to another to another. So after about the second or third commencement event that I'm moderating, I told my speechwriter, I said, I need to tell these kids, these students, that they ought to be commended for what they have accomplished and what they persevered under the COVID situation. So find something that I can tell them. And then she came back and said, I can't find anything. I have a whole menu of speeches and comments,
mhm,
alphabetically by topics. I was looking for one for perseverance and grit.
mhm,
And so I went in there and took a quote, a couple sentences out of what Admiral McCraven had talked about. And I gave it to my speechwriter, and she submitted it. And here I am at the next session. I'm reading it. And it was in there without attribution. Um, and I accepted full responsibility for that because I should have known better. I'm focused on one event after another. Honest mistake, but what I did is I said a comment that was attributed to somebody else that was said without attribution. That is called plagiarism. So a president of a university in such a public forum does something like that, it's certainly going to grab a lot of attention, as it should, and well, I realized right away, this goes back to the trust thing, that you this is something you is not tolerable within the academic communities, especially in higher education. And so there was an issue of trust with the faculty and trust with the administration and trust with my board. So I went to my board and I said, if we don't have trust, then obviously I lose my ability to lead because I'm no longer effective because there's no trust. And as a result, it's time for me to leave and someone else that needs to come in there. And and I accept full responsibility. This is something obviously I should have picked up. I should have known. There was no intent whatsoever
mhm.
to grab those comments without attribution. And so, nevertheless, I felt that because of the trust issues that were in place, that I needed to leave. And you know, Hannah, that was the hardest decision. It was the most the one of the most toughest decisions I had to make. Something I'm very not proud of whatsoever. I accept full responsibility for it, and that's kind of the story behind it.
Well, I remember reading about it in the news years ago, and I thought the way you navigated the experience displayed just the utmost character. Can you tell us kind of what role you think, social media played in those, events, whether it's like media coverage, people's reactions, and any advice for today's leaders who are navigating, a very similar operating, environment?
Well, you've got to compete on the social media side. So you've got to be effective yourself with social media because social media is out there. And one of the problems I had is that, and I should have known better, that I was a very unpopular president. And there were protests against me when I was
Mhm.
during the presidential interviews. Um, and I realized this is not a place to the this is not a happy place for the Caslen or the Caslen family just because of the protests and stuff like that. I thought I could win them all over. I thought I was making great progress, but when this embarrassing situation occurred, there was a lot of meat out there for those, I call them the haters, those that didn't appreciate who I was and where I came from with a military background now. in higher education, and uh, um, I realized that like I said, it was time for me to go. Social media inflamed
Mhm.
the situation, so it grabbed so much attention that other groups like national news,
Mhm.
and even of course, the board. I went to the board. They said, "No, you'll be able to get through this." And I said, "I don't think I will." And another couple of days later, they said, "Okay," because I had already submitted my resignation. And then they said, "Okay, we'll accept your resignation," because there was so much backlash as a result of the social media and other things. But that's the nature of the business. That's the nature of what the way it is today. So you just got to be able to understand it and understand how best to navigate through that and to make sure that your story is told, and it's told to the equally, as well as all the other different conspiracy stories that are going to be out there as well.
Oh, that's great advice. I know, the stuff that goes viral, just because it goes viral doesn't mean it's true or accurate. So I appreciate your reminder of,
Well,
uh,
in this case it was true,
yeah,
but I mean it was not something that was done on purpose.
right.
Uh, but it had the impact of lack of trust, like I said, and that's when I realized this is not something I want to be a part of.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. So from a national security standpoint, can you tell us what's on your radar, right now? What threats you're tracking or you think our nation should be, tracking and kind of prioritizing how to address?
Um, well, of course, we still want to make sure that we understand the terrorist threat that exists within the world that's out there within our own nation. The fabulous job the FBI does to keep all that in line, and uh, you know, and we got to make sure that we have the right strategies to deal with all that. And I think we do. A lot of the questions that at least today's news is about Iran, and of course Venezuela and Cuba and places like that. And my only comment is what are our national interests and what are the strategies to protect or to achieve them? A strategy is what is your end state and what are your programs and what are your resources to accomplish those programs. And we got to make sure that we have nailed down our national interests. And that's my concern with leaving Iraq. The national interest that we had when we had 50,000 soldiers on the ground did not change a bit from when we had 50,000. They withdrew to 157 that I was in charge of for foreign military sales. The national interests were still the same, but we failed to make sure that we had the right programs and resources because changing 50,000 to 157 is a significant difference. So can those 157 accomplish your national interests? And if so, what are the programs that are going to be necessary? And a lot of that hadn't been thought through. Their assumption was that we're going to leave because we need to leave. We're not going to have any authorities for return of any U.S. forces whatsoever. Iraq was going to be on its own, and we were just going to have to live with what was out there. And you know, my criticism is we just got to make sure that we think through what our national interests are and make sure we have the right strategies and programs and resources for those strategies. And this is key too, because we failed to do this, that we have the authorities. Where does the authority come from? Congress. Congress is the one that writes the authorities for you to be there. And also the security of forces agreement that's got to come between you and the nation that you're working with. And those are the authorities that get you there, that keep you there, and that protect your rights as well. So those authorities evaporated, and we failed to go back and get those authorities and put them in place.
Yeah. It's a great, great advice on moving forward. Do you have any final words of advice or parting thoughts for the audience today?
Well, the one thing that inspired me to go back to West Point as a superintendent was, and I was the commandant of cadets, which is a one-star
Mhm.
position. before I was the 3-star. And you're in the middle of Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom, so the war is still going on. And these young men and women, regardless of what was out there, they wanted to serve their country. And contrary to the vast majority of their peers who chose a safer existence, these young men and women wanted to and they joined their country that was at war, knowing that when they graduated, they would go to war. Those are very special people. They inspired me, Hannah. And I wanted, and I enjoyed being around them because you don't find people when your country's at war. These young men and women want to join the military so they can go to war for their country. And if you have any doubts about the future of your nation, just turn towards these. I call them the 9/11 generation. Turn to these 9/11 generation young men and women who saw their country attacked and they wanted to do something about it. So they inspired me. Service to country is it's a unique but a very rewarding and a very special calling. And my advice to anybody that's out there is think about an opportunity to how you would want to serve your country or how you would want to serve your state or your community. Just if you want to be a leader, be a leader of character, but be a leader that contributes to the good of the nation and the good of this of your government. And those people inspire. A lot of times you find leadership, effective leadership in the corporate world, but leadership in the government and leadership to serve your country, particularly in the military or even first responders, those people are very special. And the vast majority of their peers elect not to do something like that. So it's great to be around them and to help them and to mentor them. But at the same time, America should feel very great. I know America does, but should feel very grateful for the young men and women that continually want to serve their country and to stand in the gap to protect our nation.
Well, thank you so much, General Caslen, for sharing your insights, your experiences today. I know your contributions have impacted so many in our own nation and around the world, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me on the podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure being with you, Hannah. Thank you very much for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. We hope this conversation has sparked new ideas and challenged the way you think about our future. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time with another exciting guest.